Welcome to another quiet evening together. Tonight we begin a long, slow journey backward through time into the silent fields of medieval England in search of an answer to a quiet mystery that has rested beneath the grass of a Yorkshire hillside for the better part of 1,000 years. It is the kind of mystery that does not announce itself. It does not appear in the history books you were handed at school. It does not stand in a glass case in a great museum with a tidy little card beside it explaining everything away. And yet it is there, just under the soft green turf, waiting, as it has waited through century after century of rain and frost and the slow turning of the seasons. For in a shallow pit on the edge of a vanished village, the bones of at least 10 people were found broken and burned and cut apart, in a way that no ordinary Christian burial in medieval England should ever look. These were not the bones of soldiers fallen in some forgotten battle. They were not the remains of strangers, or of enemies, or of travellers who had died far from home and been buried without ceremony. They were, as far as anyone has ever been able to tell, the village's own dead. Its neighbours, its grandmothers and its grandfathers, its sons and its daughters, and perhaps even its children. And the reason they were treated in this strange and violent way was so far outside what we are usually taught about the gentle, praying, church-bound world of the Middle Ages that it took archaeologists the better part of 2 centuries of patient digging and one careful modern study, even to begin to understand what they were truly looking at. Tonight we are going to understand it together, slowly and gently and in no hurry at all. We are going to walk back into a single English village, a real place with a real name, and we're going to live in it for a little while, in the warmth of its hearths and the cold of its winters. We're going to stand in its fields and listen to its bell, and then, very quietly, we're going to follow the trail of those broken bones, down through the layers of the soil and down through the layers of the medieval mind, into one of the strangest and most human fears that the people of this island ever carried. The fear that the dead might not stay dead. The fear that, on certain nights, in certain places, the buried might rise. If you find comfort in these long, gentle journeys through the forgotten corners of history, please consider subscribing to the channel. It costs nothing at all, and it helps these slow, softly told stories find the people who need them most. The people lying awake in the dark, in the small and sleepless hours, looking for a calm voice and an old story to carry them down, at last, into rest. There is no need to stay awake to the end. There will be no sudden noise, no jolt, no bright and startling turn, only the quiet unspooling of a true and forgotten thing. So settle yourself, let your shoulders soften, let the light go low, and stay with me, because by the time we're finished tonight, what you understand about the people of medieval England, about what they feared in the dark, and about what they were willing to do in the face of that fear, will not be quite the same as when we began. Let us begin, as all these stories must begin, with the land. Because before there was a mystery, and before there were bones in a pit, there was a place. An ordinary place in an ordinary corner of England that asked nothing of history and expected to be remembered by no one. It is the great quiet truth of the medieval world that almost everyone who ever lived in it passed through it without leaving a single written word behind. They were born, and they laboured, and they loved and feared and grew old, and they died, and the earth took them back, and the only record of their having lived at all is the faint mark they left upon the ground. The shape of a house worn into a hillside, the line of a field, a scattering of bones. To go looking for these people is to go looking for the most ordinary lives that have ever been lived, and that is exactly why their story matters so much. For when one of these silent, ordinary places suddenly does something extraordinary, something that breaks every gentle assumption we hold about it, we are forced to look again and to see that the past was always far stranger and far deeper than the version we were given. So tonight we go looking for one such place. It lies in the north of England, in the county of Yorkshire, in a stretch of high, rolling chalk country known as the Wolds. and it has a name, soft and old and almost musical, a name that has outlived every person who ever answered to it. The village was called Wharram Percy. Hold that name gently in your mind as we begin to walk toward it, because we are going to come to know it very well. We are going to know its fields and its houses, its church and its churchyard, its long centuries of patient life and its slow and quiet death. And we are going to learn the terrible thing that some of its people once did on some forgotten night by the light of a low fire, out of a love and a terror that we can still, across all these years, almost understand. The past is deeper than anyone told you, and it is waiting just beneath the grass for us to come and listen. So let us go there now, together, into the high, quiet country of the Yorkshire Wolds, and let us see the place where the dead would not stay buried. Picture the Yorkshire Wolds. If you have never seen them, let me paint them for you, slowly, because the land itself is part of this story. The Wolds are a band of low chalk hills that rise gently out of the eastern side of Yorkshire, rolling away in long smooth swells like the surface of a sea that has been stilled and turned to grass. There are no jagged peaks here, no dark and dramatic crags. The beauty of this country is a quiet, understated thing. It is the beauty of wide skies and open distances, of pale chalk showing through the green where a track has worn down to the bone of the land, of dry valleys that wind between the hills without a single stream running through them, because the water sinks straight down through the chalk and vanishes underground. It is a landscape that seems, even now, to hold its breath. Stand in one of those dry valleys on a still day, and the silence is almost a presence. The wind moves through the long grass with a soft, continuous hush. A skylark rises somewhere overhead, pouring out its thin and endless song. Sheep graze on the slopes, as sheep have grazed here for longer than anyone can properly say. And there is a feeling, hard to put into words, that the land remembers more than it tells, that under the smooth green skin of these hills there are stories folded away and kept. It is in one of these dry valleys that Wharram Percy lies, or rather, that it lay, for there is very little of it left to see now, and that absence is the first strange thing about it. If you walk down into the valley today, following the path that leads to the site, you will come at last to a place that feels, at first, like nothing at all. A green hollow in the hills, a small pond, still and dark, fringed with reeds, and rising above it, the one thing that has refused to disappear entirely, the ruined church of St. Martin. Stand before that church for a moment. It is roofless now, open to the grey Yorkshire sky. Its walls are broken and patched with moss. Its windows are empty arches through which the clouds drift by. The tower still stands, or part of it does, leaning against the centuries. Inside, where once there were pews and candlelight and the murmur of prayer, there is only grass and fallen stone and the cold, clean air. It is a beautiful ruin, and a deeply melancholy one, because a ruined church is a ruined gathering place, and a gathering place with no one left to gather is one of the saddest things in the world. And then, when you turn away from the church and look out across the valley, you begin to see the rest of it. Not buildings, for there are no buildings left, but shapes. Faint low ripples in the turf, running in lines and rectangles across the grass. Long shallow terraces stepping down the slope. Hollows where the ground dips for no natural reason. To the untrained eye, it is simply uneven ground, the ordinary lumpiness of an old field. But to anyone who has learned to read it, this is the ghost of a village. Those ripples are the buried foundations of houses. Those terraces are the platforms the houses stood upon. That long, straight hollow is a street, walked smooth by feet that have been dust for 500 years. The whole valley is a vast and silent map, drawn in earth and grass, of a place where people once lived their entire lives. This is what we call a deserted medieval village, and Wharram Percy is the most famous of them all. Not because anything spectacular ever happened here in the eyes of the wider world. No king was crowned here, no battle was fought, no great cathedral was raised. It is famous because it was studied, because for more than 60 years, longer than almost any archaeological project in the country, careful people came back to this quiet valley, season after season, and slowly, patiently, lovingly lifted the story of an ordinary medieval village out of the ground. And it is famous too now for the strange and troubling thing they found here, set apart from the rest, that no one had expected and that no one could easily explain. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We must not run. This is a slow journey, remember, and the slowness is the point. So before we disturb a single bone, before we even speak again of the pit and what was in it, let us do the kindest thing we can do for a forgotten place. Let us bring it back to life. Let us stand here in this empty, silent valley with its ruined church and its rippling grass, and let us imagine it as it once was, not empty, not silent, but full of smoke and noise and animals and people, full of the ordinary, precious, unrecorded business of human life. Close your eyes for a moment if you are not already drifting, and let the centuries roll back. Let the grass sink away and the houses rise. Let the ruined church mend its roof and fill with candlelight. Let the empty valley fill again with the lowing of cattle and the voices of children and the smell of wood smoke on the cold morning air. Let us go back, all the way back, to Wharram Percy as it stood in the high Middle Ages around the year 1200, when it was not a memory and not a mystery, but simply a home. It is a morning in early summer in the year 1200, and Wharram Percy is waking up. The light comes grey and soft over the eastern hills first, long before the sun itself appears, and with it comes the first thin thread of wood smoke, then another, rising from the roofs of the houses as the fires are coaxed back to life from the embers banked the night before. There is a smell to a medieval morning that we have almost entirely lost, and it is the smell of wood smoke and damp earth and animals and bread, all mingled together in the cold air, and to the people of Wharram Percy, it was simply the smell of being alive. The houses stand in 2 long rows, following the line of the slope, looking down toward the stream-fed pond at the valley bottom. They are not the crooked, charming cottages of a painting. They are long, low buildings, built of timber frames filled in with wattle and daub, which is to say, a lattice of woven branches packed and smeared with a mixture of clay and straw and dung, and then whitewashed, or simply left to weather. The roofs are thatched with straw or reed, thick and shaggy and dark with age. Most of these houses are what we would call longhouses, a single long room shared, at least in the colder months, by a family at one end and their precious animals at the other. We might wrinkle our noses at the thought, but to them it was warmth and security and good sense. The body heat of a cow or an ox on a winter night was not a discomfort to be endured, but a gift to be grateful for, and the animals were far too valuable to leave outside in the dark where the cold or a thief or a wolf might take them. Inside, the house is dim and smoky. There is no chimney, only a hole in the roof or a gap under the eaves through which the smoke from the central hearth finds its slow way out, and so the upper air is always hazy, and the underside of the thatch is black and glistening with soot. The floor is beaten earth, perhaps strewn with rushes. There is very little furniture, a trestle table, a bench or two, a chest for the family's few treasured possessions, pallets of straw for sleeping. A pot hangs over the fire. Bunches of herbs hang from the beams, and this single smoky room is the whole world of a family, the place where they are born and eat and sleep and sicken and very often die. Above the 2 rows of houses, on the better ground, stand the manor houses, for Wharram Percy in its time was held by more than one lordly family, and the village takes the second half of its very name from one of them, the Percys, a name that would go on to become one of the great names of the north. The manor is grander than the peasant houses, built more solidly, with more rooms and more comfort, but by the standards of any later age it too is a rough and simple place. and rising over all of it, at the heart of the community, stands the Church of St. Martin, already old in 1200, already built and rebuilt across the generations, its stone tower the one truly permanent thing in a village made mostly of wood and earth and thatch. The church is the still point around which everything turns. Its bell marks the hours of work and prayer, its calendar marks the turning of the year, its walls hold the village's baptisms and its weddings, and its surrounding ground holds the village's dead. And the people, let us not forget the people, for they are the whole point of all of this. Who lived here, in these smoky houses, under this grey sky? They were farmers, almost every one of them, for this was a world that ran on the growing of food and the keeping of animals, and almost everyone was bound in one way or another to that endless work. Many of them were not free in the way we understand the word. They were villains, sometimes called serfs, and a villain was a person bound to the manor and to the lord who held it. He could not simply leave. He owed the lord days of his own labour on the lord's land, and a share of what he grew on his own, and a whole tangle of dues and fines and obligations that governed almost every part of his life. To grind his grain he had to use the lord's mill and pay for the privilege. To marry off a daughter he might owe a fee. When he died, the lord might claim his best beast. It was a hard life, and we should not pretend otherwise, nor should we romanticize it. But it was not a life without meaning, or without joy, or without its own deep order. The villager of Wharram Percy knew exactly who he was and where he belonged. He knew the name of every field, and the moods of every season, and the faces of every soul in the valley. His world was almost unimaginably small to us, who can cross continents in a day. Many of these people would never travel more than a few miles from the place where they were born in their entire lives. The next market town was a great expedition. The city of York, not so very far away, was a place most of them would only ever hear about. Their horizon was the rim of the hills around the valley, and within that rim was everything they knew, and everything they loved and everything they feared. And their lives ran to the rhythm of the land. In spring there was the ploughing and the sowing, the great communal labour of breaking the heavy soil with ox teams and scattering the seed for the year's bread. In summer there was the endless tending, the weeding, the haymaking, the watching of the sky for the rain that could bless or ruin a crop. In autumn came the harvest, the most important weeks of the entire year, when the whole village bent its back together to gather in the grain that would, with luck, see them through the winter, and when failure meant not inconvenience but hunger, real hunger, the gnawing kind that killed. And then in winter came the quiet and the dark and the cold, the slaughtering of the animals that could not be fed through to spring, the long nights around the fire, the waiting. This was Wharram Percy, alive, a close, hard, ordered, deeply rooted little world, turning slowly through the seasons under the wide Yorkshire sky, year after year, generation after generation for 600 years. The same families very often working the same strips of the same fields, sitting in the same church, lying at last in the same churchyard for century upon century. There is something almost overwhelming in that continuity when you stop to consider it. A child born in that valley in 1200 could look around at the houses and the fields and the church and know that his great-great-great-grandparents had looked upon very nearly the same scene, and could imagine, rightly, that his great-great-great-grandchildren would look upon it too. Permanence, belonging, a place in a long unbroken chain. And it is precisely because their world was so settled, so ordered, so bound by custom and faith and the proper way of doing things, that the thing we are about to uncover is so very startling. For these were not wild people, or lawless people, or people without God. They were Christian villagers in a Christian land, who buried their dead in consecrated ground with prayers for their souls, as their ancestors had done and their children would do. And yet some of them, on some night that left no record but the one written in bone, did something to their own dead that broke every one of those gentle rules. To understand why, we must first understand how death and the dead were supposed to be handled in this world. We must understand the ordinary before we can make sense of the terrible exception. Death was never far away in a place like Wharram Percy. We must understand this, gently but fully, if we are to understand everything that follows, because the people of the medieval village lived on far more intimate terms with death than almost anyone reading or hearing these words has ever had to. Death was not hidden away in hospitals and care homes, attended by strangers and spoken of in hushed and careful language. Death happened in the house. It happened in the smoky single room, on the straw pallet with the family gathered close. It was a familiar visitor, an expected one, and though it was mourned, deeply and truly mourned, it was never a stranger. Consider the simple, terrible arithmetic of medieval life. Of every group of children born in that village, a great many would not live to see their 5th birthday. Some estimates suggest that as many as a quarter, perhaps more in a bad year, died in infancy or early childhood, carried off by the fevers and the fluxes and the coughing sicknesses that we now prevent or cure without a second thought. A mother might bear 7 or 8 children across her life and count herself fortunate to raise half of them to adulthood. And childbirth itself was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do, a shadow that fell across every pregnancy, so that to bring a new life into the village was always, also, to risk a death. Those who survived childhood were not then promised long lives. The work was brutally hard, bending the body and wearing the joints. The diet was thin and monotonous, and, in the lean months before the harvest, dangerously scarce. A bad harvest, or 2 bad harvests in a row, could bring famine sweeping through the valley, and famine killed, both directly and by weakening people until some lesser sickness finished them. Injuries that we would shrug off, a deep cut, a broken bone, a rotten tooth, could fester and turn deadly with no antibiotics and no real medicine to stop them. And over all of it hung the ever-present threat of epidemic disease, the fevers that could empty half a village in a season. To live in the medieval world was to know, in your bones and from your earliest years, that death could come for anyone, at any time, young or old, strong or weak, and that there was very little anyone could do to stop it. But here is the thing that we, in our own death-fearing and death-avoiding age, often fail to grasp. The people of Wharram Percy were not paralysed by this. They did not live in constant terror. They lived instead within a vast and comforting structure of belief and ritual that gave death a meaning and gave the living something to do. And at the centre of that structure stood the church. For the medieval Christian, death was not an ending but a passage. The soul did not simply wink out. It went onward to judgment, and then to its long destiny. And the whole great machinery of the church existed in large part to help the souls of the dead along that fearful road. This is why the manner of dying mattered so enormously. A good death, the death that everyone hoped for and prayed for, was a death with warning. A death you could see coming. A death that gave you time to make your peace, to confess your sins to a priest, to receive the last rites, to be shriven and anointed and sent on your way with the blessing of the church and the prayers of your family ringing in your ears. To die like that, in your bed, surrounded by those who loved you, with your soul made ready, was to die well. And when death came, there was a proper way to handle the body and the soul that it had left behind. The body was washed and wrapped, most often simply in a shroud of plain cloth. For coffins were a luxury that ordinary villagers could rarely afford. It was carried to the church, and prayers were said, and then it was laid in the consecrated ground of the churchyard, the holy earth that surrounded St. Martin's. This mattered beyond all measure. To be buried in consecrated ground, among your ancestors and your neighbours, within the sound of the church bell and the shadow of the church tower, was to be buried safely. It was to be laid to rest under the protection of the church and within the community of the faithful, both the living and the dead, to await the final resurrection in peace. And the dead were not then forgotten. They were prayed for. The living believed with complete sincerity that the prayers of those left behind could ease the journey of the departed soul, could shorten its trials, could speed it on toward its rest. The dead and the living remained, in a sense, members of a single community, bound together by love and by prayer across the boundary of the grave. The dead in the churchyard were not gone. They were simply waiting quietly in holy ground, while their living kin remembered them and prayed for them, and in their own time came to join them. This, then, was the ordinary way of death in Wharram Percy, repeated thousands upon thousands of times across the 6 centuries of the village's life. A death in the smoky house, a washing and a wrapping, a carrying to the church, a burial in the consecrated ground, a remembering. It was sorrowful, but it was safe, and it was right, and it was the same for everyone, from the lord in his manor to the poorest villain in his longhouse. All of them, in the end, came to the same churchyard and the same holy earth. Hold this picture firmly in your mind, because it is the measure against which everything that follows must be set. When we come very soon now to that pit of broken and burned and scattered bones, the first thing that will strike the careful observer is not merely the violence done to those bodies. It is that they were not in the churchyard at all. They were not in the consecrated ground. They were set apart away from the holy earth and away from the waiting community of the faithful dead. And to a medieval villager, that was not a small thing. That was a profound thing. That was a deliberate and frightening thing. To be denied the churchyard was to be denied the safety and the protection and the rightness of a proper Christian burial. It was a fate reserved for the most troubling of the dead, and it was never ever done lightly. So we have stood in the living village. We have warmed ourselves at its fires and walked its single street and watched its people bend to their endless work beneath the wide grey sky. We have come to understand how they lived and how they died and how they cared for their dead with love and with prayer and with the deep ordered comfort of their faith. We have seen the gentle, proper, Christian shape of death in Wharram Percy, and now, with that picture held warm and clear in our minds, we must do something that no one in the village ever could. We must leap forward across the centuries, past the village's slow death and long silence, into our own age of careful science and patient excavation. For it was only in the modern world, with trowels and brushes and the slow reading of bones, that anyone ever discovered the strange exception to all of that gentle order. It was only when the archaeologists came that the broken dead were found at last, and so to them, and to their long and patient labour, we must now turn. The story of how Wharram Percy was rediscovered is, in its own quiet way, almost as remarkable as the story buried within it. For centuries after the village died, it was simply forgotten. The fields where the houses had stood were grazed by sheep. The ruined church mouldered slowly under the weather. Local people knew, in the vague way that local people often do, that there had once been something here, a village, a settlement, gone now. But no one thought it worth much attention. It was just an empty valley with an old church in it, one of countless quiet, overlooked corners of the English countryside. And then, in the years after the Second World War, 2 men turned their attention to it, and everything changed. One was a historian, a scholar of the documents and records of the medieval economy. The other was an archaeologist, a reader of the ground itself. And what began, in 1948, almost as a modest inquiry into a single deserted site, grew and grew, season after season, year after year, decade after decade, until Wharram Percy had become the longest-running and most influential excavation of a medieval village ever undertaken in Britain. For more than 40 seasons, summer after summer, teams of archaeologists and students and volunteers returned to that quiet valley and gave it their patient, devoted attention. They did not rush. They did not tear into the ground in search of treasure. They worked slowly and carefully and with enormous respect for the ordinary lives they were uncovering. It is worth pausing here, in the slow and patient spirit of those archaeologists, to understand just what it is that they do, because the reading of a deserted village is one of the most painstaking and beautiful kinds of work that human beings have ever devised. To the untrained eye, as we have said, the site of Wharram Percy is just lumpy ground, but the trained eye reads those lumps like a page of text. Every ripple and hollow and terrace in the turf is the trace of something that was once built and lived in and abandoned. The archaeologist learns to see the buried foundations of a longhouse in a low rectangular swelling of the grass. He learns to read the line of a vanished street, the platform of a manor, the boundary of a croft, the shape of a field. And then, where the surface promises something, they dig, not with great machines, not with haste, but by hand, with trowels and brushes, peeling back the soil one thin layer at a time. For the soil, to an archaeologist, is not a single thing, but a stack of pages, each layer laid down at a different time, each one holding the record of a different moment in the life of the place. A floor of beaten earth, a scatter of charcoal where a hearth once burned, a line of post holes where the timbers of a house once stood, a broken pot, a worn coin, a bone needle, a child's lost toy. Each fragment, carefully lifted and recorded and placed in its exact context, is a word in a sentence, and the sentences slowly build into the story of the place. It is detective work of the most patient and humble kind, and over the long decades of their labour at Wharram Percy, the archaeologists assembled from these countless fragments a portrait of medieval village life more complete and more intimate than almost anywhere else in the country. They learned how the houses were built and rebuilt and shifted across the centuries. They traced the church of St. Martin through all its many phases, watching it grow and shrink and change across 600 years. They mapped the fields and the boundaries and the slow evolution of the whole community. And crucially for our story, they turned their attention to the dead. For around the church lay the churchyard, the consecrated ground, and over the centuries of the village's life, the people of Wharram Percy had buried their dead there in their hundreds. The archaeologists, with great care and great respect, excavated many of these burials, lifting the bones of ordinary medieval villagers from the holy earth where they had lain for so long. And here, before we come to the strange and the troubling, let us honour what those ordinary bones revealed. For the dead have a great deal to tell us if we know how to listen, and the human skeleton is a kind of diary, written slowly over a lifetime in the language of bone. The bones of the Wharram Percy dead spoke of hard lives and hard labour, of spines and joints worn down by a lifetime of bending and lifting and toil. They spoke of childhood hunger, recorded in faint lines across the teeth and bones that mark the seasons when a growing body did not have enough to eat. They spoke of the diseases these people suffered, and the injuries they endured, and the ages at which they died. They told us, in short, the truth of medieval village life, not as the chronicles told it, written by monks and nobles about kings and battles, but as the ordinary people actually lived it, written in their own bodies. It is one of the great gifts of archaeology, this ability to give a voice to the voiceless, to let the forgotten poor of the past speak to us at last across the centuries, through the patient reading of their bones. So the archaeologists came, season after season, for the better part of half a century. They read the ground, and they read the houses, and they read the church, and they read the dead in the churchyard. They built out of all this patient labour the fullest picture we possess of how an ordinary English village lived and died across the long medieval centuries. It was, by any measure, a triumph of slow and careful scholarship, and it might have remained simply that, the definitive study of medieval village life, complete and orderly and gentle. But the ground at Wharram Percy held one more thing, something that did not fit, something that lay apart from the orderly churchyard and the gentle picture it had given. Among all the ordinary dead, laid properly to rest in their consecrated ground, there was a different set of remains entirely. Not in the churchyard, not laid out with care, but broken and burned and scattered in a pit near where the living houses had stood. And when at last that strange assemblage of bones was studied closely, with all the patient science the modern world could bring to bear, it told a story that no one had been looking for and that no one, at first, quite wanted to believe. It is to that pit and to those broken bones that we now, at last, must turn. The bones were found not in the churchyard, where the proper dead of Wharram Percy lay in their long and peaceful ranks, but elsewhere, in the area of the village where the living had once had their houses. This, as we have already learned, is the first strange thing, and to a careful eye it is a very loud strangeness indeed. These remains had been deliberately kept apart from the consecrated ground. Whoever placed them here had chosen, for some reason, not to give them the safe and holy burial that every ordinary villager received. That choice alone tells us that something unusual was happening, but it is only the beginning. Let us look closely at what was actually found, slowly and carefully, the way the researchers themselves had to. The remains were not a single intact skeleton, laid out in the dignified posture of a proper burial, lying on its back with its hands folded, its head to the west, as a Christian burial should be. They were a jumble, a collection of bones mingled together, representing not one person but many. When the specialists came to study them and to count the individuals present, they concluded that the bones belonged to at least 10 different people. Some accounts put the total number of bone fragments at well over 100. At least 10 human beings, then, gathered together in this one strange deposit. And these 10 were not all of a kind. They were not, for instance, all young men, which might have suggested warriors, or executed criminals, or the victims of some violence aimed at the strong. They were a cross-section of an ordinary community. There were adults of various ages, some in the prime of life, some who had lived into what passed for old age in the medieval world, and there were children, young people, their bones still bearing the marks of growth, gathered here among the adults, men, women and children, of many ages together. Whatever had brought these 10 people to this pit, it was not something that singled out one type of person. It was something that could reach anyone. A grandmother, a grown man, a child. So we have a group of ordinary villagers, of all ages and both sexes, buried apart from the consecrated ground, their bones mingled together rather than laid out in proper individual graves. That alone would be enough to make an archaeologist pause and frown and look closer. But it is when they did look closer, when they took up each bone and turned it in the light and examined its surface under magnification, that the true strangeness of this deposit revealed itself, for the bones bore marks, deliberate marks, the signs of things that had been done to these bodies, after death, by human hands. The first thing they saw was burning. Many of the bones were scorched and blackened and discoloured by fire. This was not the complete even burning of a cremation, where a body is consumed entirely by intense and sustained heat, until little remains but ash and fragments. It was something more partial, more uneven, more selective. Certain bones and certain parts of bones had been exposed to fire, while others had not. The pattern of the burning suggested that the bodies had been burned when there was still some flesh upon them, the heat marking the bone where the protecting flesh was thinnest. Fire, then, had been deliberately brought to these dead. The second thing they saw was breakage. Bones had been broken, snapped and shattered, and not in the way that bones break naturally over the long centuries of lying in the ground, where the slow weight of the earth and the action of the soil can crack and crush them. These breaks bore the signs of having been made deliberately, around the time of death or shortly after, when the bones were still fresh and held the springiness of living bone. Something had broken these bodies apart with intention and with force. And the third thing, the most chilling thing of all, was the cut marks. On a number of the bones there were knife marks, fine, clean incisions, the unmistakable signature of a metal blade drawn across bone. These were not the random gouges of an accident or the marks of scavenging animals. They were deliberate cuts, made by a person with a sharp tool, working on these bodies with some purpose in mind. Someone had taken a blade to these dead. Sit with that for a moment, in the quiet of the evening, and feel how strange it is. Here, in an ordinary English village, in a Christian community that buried its dead with prayer in consecrated ground, a group of 10 people, men and women and children, had been treated in death in a way utterly unlike all the others, set apart from the holy earth, burned, broken, cut with a blade. Their bones, when they were found at last all those centuries later, still carried the record of this strange violence, written in scorch marks and fractures and the clean fine lines of the knife. This is the heart of our mystery laid bare at last. This is the thing that no one had been looking for, the thing that did not fit the gentle and orderly picture of medieval village life that the long years of patient excavation had so carefully assembled. The question now was as simple to ask as it was difficult and disturbing to answer. Who were these 10 people? Why had they, alone of all the dead of Wharram Percy, been denied the consecrated ground? And above all, why had their bodies been burned and broken and cut apart by the hands of their own community, in this small and pious and ordinary place? There are, when you first encounter a mystery like this, a number of explanations that leap immediately to mind. Dark explanations, most of them, for the marks themselves are dark. And the work of the researchers, the slow and careful detective work that would eventually lead them to an answer almost too strange to credit, began exactly where good detective work always begins, not with a wild leap to the most dramatic conclusion, but with the patient ruling out, one by one, of the explanations that seem at first the most obvious. We will follow them now down that careful path. We will consider as they considered the possibility that this was the work of hunger, of famine so terrible that it drove a village to the most desperate of all acts. And we will see, as they saw, why the bones themselves, in the end, told a different and a stranger story. The darkest explanation, and in some ways the most obvious one, was hunger. We have already touched upon the precariousness of medieval life, the way that everything depended upon the harvest, and the way that a failed harvest, or worse, a run of failed harvests, could tip a whole community from hard but sufficient living into outright starvation. Famine was not a rare and distant horror in medieval England. It was a recurring visitor, an ever-present possibility lurking at the edge of every year. And there were times, well-documented times, when famine struck this land with terrible force. The early 14th century in particular saw a catastrophe that historians call the Great Famine, when years of relentless rain rotted the crops in the fields and drowned the land and brought hunger sweeping across northern Europe on a scale that is hard to imagine. People died in their hundreds of thousands, and in the very worst of such times, in isolated and desperate cases, the chronicles and the records whisper of things that the human mind recoils from, of people driven by starvation to the most extreme and forbidden act of all, of the eating of the dead. It is an unbearable thought, and we should not dwell on it cruelly, but we must consider it honestly, because the researchers had to consider it. If the people of Wharram Percy had, in some terrible season of famine, been driven to consume the bodies of those who had already died in a desperate bid to keep the living alive a little longer, then that might explain a great deal. It might explain the cut marks, where a blade had been used to work on the bodies. It might explain the breakage, where bones had been smashed to reach the nourishing marrow within, exactly as our distant ancestors had done to the bones of animals since the very dawn of humankind. It might even, in a grim way, explain the burning, the cooking of human flesh. And it might explain why these dead were not in the consecrated ground, for such an act, born of utter desperation, would be a source of deepest shame, something to be hidden away, buried apart, never spoken of. It is a coherent theory. It is a horrifying theory. And the researchers took it seriously, as they were bound to do. But here is where the patient, careful science of reading bones begins to earn its keep, because the bones themselves, when questioned closely, began to argue against it. And the argument they made turned on a single, crucial detail: the placement of the cut marks. When a human being butchers a body for meat, whether the body of an animal or, in the unthinkable extreme, the body of another human being, the cuts they make are not random. They are purposeful, and their purpose is to recover flesh and nourishment as efficiently as possible. And so the cut marks left by butchery fall in characteristic places. They cluster around the major muscle masses, where the meat is. They gather at the great joints, the shoulder, the hip, the knee, the places where a carcass must be disarticulated and broken down into manageable pieces. They appear where there is something worth taking, and where the body must be opened up to take it. This is simply the logic of butchery, and it leaves a recognizable signature on bone, a signature that archaeologists who study ancient diets and ancient cannibalism have learned to read with confidence. But the cut marks on the bones of Wharram Percy did not follow this pattern. They did not cluster at the great muscles and the great joints in the manner of butchery for food. Instead, they were concentrated elsewhere. They were found, above all, around the head and the neck in the region of the upper body, and this placement makes very little sense if the goal was to recover meat, for the head and neck are not where the nourishment of a body lies. There is little there worth the eating. To concentrate one's blade upon the head and the neck is not the act of someone trying to feed themselves. It is the act of someone trying to do something else entirely. What, then, would lead a person to take a blade and work it around the head and the neck of a corpse? The answer, when it comes, carries us out of the realm of hunger and into a far stranger country. For the act of cutting at the neck is the act of decapitation, of separating or attempting to separate the head from the body. And the breaking of the bones in this new light looks less like the smashing of bones for marrow and more like the deliberate dismemberment of a body, the breaking of it apart so that it could not be whole. And the burning too takes on a different meaning, not the cooking of flesh for food, but the destruction of a body by fire, the reduction of it toward ash. Do you see what's happening here? The bones are telling us that whatever was done to these 10 people, it was not done to feed the living. It was done to the dead, for the sake of the dead, or rather for the sake of protecting the living from the dead. The pattern is not the pattern of the kitchen. It is the pattern of destruction, of unmaking, of taking a body and deliberately, systematically rendering it incapable of ever again being a whole and functioning thing. The head cut at, the bones broken, the whole burned. This was the first great turning point in the investigation, the moment when the obvious dark explanation of famine began to fall away, and a stranger and more troubling possibility began to take its place. But the researchers were careful people, and they did not leap. There remained other explanations to consider, other ways to account for a group of bodies treated with violence and denied the holy ground. Perhaps these were not villagers at all. Perhaps they were outsiders, or wrongdoers, people who fell outside the normal community, and so were buried outside its normal customs. Before they could be confident of the strange conclusion toward which the cut marks pointed, the researchers had to rule out these possibilities too, and to do that, they would turn to a kind of science that the people of Wharram Percy could never have dreamed of, a science that can read, in the chemistry locked within a person's teeth, the very ground on which they grew up. It is to that remarkable test, and to the final door it closed, that we turn next. There was another way to explain the broken bones, and it was, in its own way, a comforting one. Perhaps these 10 people were not the village's own. Perhaps they were strangers. The medieval world, for all that its people stayed close to home, was not entirely sealed. Travellers passed along the roads, peddlers and pilgrims and beggars wandered from place to place. There were outsiders, people with no kin in the valley and no place in its community, and when such a person died far from home, they could not always expect the full and tender care that a village gave to its own. And then there were wrongdoers, criminals, the excommunicated, those who had died outside the grace of the church. Such people were, by custom and by law, denied burial in consecrated ground. Their bodies were placed apart in unhallowed earth, beyond the boundary of the holy. If the 10 of Wharram Percy were strangers or criminals, then their exclusion from the churchyard would need no stranger explanation than the ordinary harshness of medieval custom. And the violence done to their bodies might be explained as punishment, or as the rough handling that the unwanted dead sometimes received. It would still be a grim story, but it would be a more ordinary one. It would mean that the village had done these things to people who were not truly part of it, to others. And there is, let us be honest, a kind of comfort in that thought, a way of holding the horror at arm's length. It is one thing for a community to treat the bodies of outsiders harshly. It is quite another for a community to do these things to its own beloved dead. So this possibility too had to be tested. And here the modern scientists reached for a tool of almost miraculous power, a way of asking a 1,000-year-old skeleton the simple question, where did you grow up? The answer to that question, it turns out, is written into our very teeth, and it stays there, locked and unchanging for as long as the teeth endure. Let me explain, gently, how this works, for it is one of the quiet wonders of modern science. As our teeth form in childhood, they take up the chemistry of the world around us, and in particular, the chemistry of the water we drink and the food we eat, which in turn reflects the chemistry of the very rocks and soil of the place where we live. Different regions with different underlying geology leave different chemical signatures, traces of particular elements in particular proportions, and these signatures are sealed into the enamel of our teeth as they grow, and then they are fixed. The enamel of an adult tooth does not change. It carries forever the chemical fingerprint of the place where its owner spent their earliest years. Lift a tooth from a 1,000-year-old skull, analyze the elements locked within its enamel, and you can read across all those centuries roughly where that person grew up, whether they were local to the place where they lay, or whether they had come from somewhere far away. So the researchers took teeth from the dead of the Wharram Percy pit, and they measured the chemistry sealed within them, and they compared it to the chemistry of the local chalk country of the Yorkshire Wolds. And the answer that came back closed the comforting door forever. These were not strangers. The chemical signatures in their teeth matched the local geology. They had grown up here, drinking the water of this place, eating the food grown in this soil, in or very near to the valley where their broken bones were found. They were not wandering outsiders. They were not strangers who had died far from home. They were local people. They were of Wharram Percy. And so the last comforting explanation fell away, and the researchers were left facing the strange and difficult truth that the bones had been pointing toward all along. These 10 people, these men and women and children, had grown up in this valley. They were part of this community. They were, in all likelihood, known to the very people who burned and broke and cut their bodies. They were neighbours. They were kin. And yet, when they died, they were not laid to rest in the consecrated ground with prayers, as everyone they had ever known had always been laid to rest. Instead, their bodies were subjected to a careful and deliberate process of destruction, decapitation, dismemberment, burning, and then they were placed apart in a pit, away from the holy earth. This was the conclusion that the lead researcher, a specialist in the study of ancient human remains named Simon Mays, working with historic England, set out in a careful study. Having weighed the evidence and ruled out the alternatives, having considered famine and cannibalism and rejected them, having considered outsiders and criminals and rejected them, he and his colleagues concluded that the explanation which best fit all of the strange facts was one that, to the modern mind, sounds almost impossible, that the people of Wharram Percy had deliberately mutilated and burned the bodies of some of their own dead, and that they had done so not out of hunger, and not out of cruelty, and not as punishment, but out of fear. Out of the genuine and desperate fear that these particular dead, if nothing were done to stop them, would not stay in their graves, that they would rise, that they would walk, that they would return. It is a conclusion that asks a great deal of us. It asks us to believe that ordinary pious Christian villagers, the same people who buried almost all of their dead with love and prayer in consecrated ground, could also, when the circumstances demanded it, dig up or lay out the bodies of their own neighbours and kin and methodically destroy them, out of terror that they might come back from death. To a mind shaped by the modern world, it sounds like madness or like a horror story, but it was not madness. It was, in its own time and in its own terms, entirely rational. It made perfect sense within the world these people inhabited. And yet, before we could be fully certain even of this, there remained one more question of plain fact to settle. A question that had to come before all the talk of belief and of fear. How old were these bones? For the answer to that single question would decide whether we were looking at a medieval horror at all, or at something else entirely. This question of age was crucial to the whole conclusion, and it shows just how easily a mystery like this can be misread. When the strange, broken, burned bones were first considered, it was a real and reasonable thing to ask, a question that had to come before all the others. How old were they? For Wharram Percy was not only a medieval village. Like so much of the English landscape, the ground there held the traces of far older human presence as well, stretching back into prehistory, into the long ages before the Romans, before the Saxons, before anything we would recognise as England at all. And the practice of burning and breaking the bodies of the dead was, in some prehistoric cultures, a perfectly ordinary funeral rite, carrying no fear and no horror at all, simply a different and ancient way of honouring the dead. So there was a real possibility to be weighed. Perhaps these bones were not medieval at all. Perhaps they were the remains of some prehistoric burial, thousands of years older than the village, and the burning and breaking were nothing more sinister than the ordinary funerary customs of a people for whom such treatment of the dead was normal and respectful. If that was so, then there would be no mystery, no fear of the walking dead, no dark night with fire and blade. Just an ancient and ordinary rite misread by modern eyes. The whole interpretation hung therefore upon the question of date. To answer it, the researchers turned to radiocarbon dating, one of the great gifts that science has given to the study of the past. The principle behind it is one of those quiet wonders of the natural world. All living things, while they live, take in carbon from their environment, and a tiny fraction of that carbon is a particular radioactive form, which decays away at a steady known rate. While a creature lives, it keeps replenishing this carbon, and the proportion stays constant. But the moment it dies, the replenishing stops, and the radioactive carbon begins, very slowly and very steadily, to decay away. Measure how much of it remains in a bone, and you can calculate with real precision how long ago that creature died. The bone itself becomes a clock, ticking down quietly across the centuries, and we have learned at last how to read its face. So the researchers took samples from the bones in the pit, and they measured the radioactive carbon remaining within them, and they read the clock. And the answer was decisive. These were not prehistoric bones. They were not the remains of some ancient and innocent funeral rite. They dated to the medieval period, to the centuries when Wharram Percy was a living Christian village, somewhere in the broad span between the 11th and the 13th centuries and the years that followed. They belonged, in other words, to exactly the world we have been exploring, to the world of villeins and longhouses, of the Church of St. Martin and the consecrated churchyard, of William of Newburgh and his sober accounts of the walking dead. The burning and the breaking were not an ancient custom. They were a medieval act, performed by Christian villagers in a Christian age who buried all their other dead with prayer in holy ground. This is what made the conclusion so startling and so secure. In a prehistoric context, burned and broken bones would mean little. They would be ordinary. But in a medieval Christian context, they are extraordinary because they run directly against everything that medieval Christianity taught about the proper treatment of the dead. A medieval Christian was supposed to be buried whole and intact and at peace in consecrated ground to await the resurrection of the body at the end of time, to burn a body, to break it, to scatter it, to deny it the holy earth, was to do something that cut against the deepest grain of the faith. And so for medieval villagers to do these things, deliberately, to their own dead, they must have been driven by a fear powerful enough to override their religion itself, a fear powerful enough to make them risk their own souls, and the souls of their dead, in order to deal with a danger they believed to be even greater. That is the measure of the terror we're dealing with, not a small unease, not a vague superstition lightly held, but a fear so overwhelming that it could push pious people to violate the most sacred customs of their own faith. The radiocarbon dating, that quiet reading of the clock in the bones, is what allows us to be certain of this. It pins the act firmly into the medieval Christian world, and in doing so it transforms a scatter of broken bones from a possible curiosity into a profound and troubling window onto the medieval heart. It was this body of careful work, the reading of the cut marks, the analysis of the burning and breakage, the testing of the isotopes that proved the dead were local, and the radiocarbon dating that proved they were medieval, that the lead researcher Simon Mays and his colleagues at Historic England brought together into their conclusion. Each strand of evidence on its own might have admitted some doubt, but woven together they formed a rope strong enough to bear the weight of an extraordinary claim that here, in the soil of an ordinary English village, lay the physical proof of one of the most haunting beliefs of the medieval world. Not a story written down by a monk, which we might dismiss as a tale, but the hard, silent, undeniable evidence of the bones themselves. The chroniclers had told us what medieval people believed about the walking dead. Now, at last, the ground itself confirmed that they had acted upon that belief, with fire and with blade, in the dark. But to understand why they believed such an act was not only permissible but necessary, why pious Christian villagers would do such a thing to their own dead, we must now do the hardest thing of all. We must leave the certainties of the laboratory behind and step instead into the medieval mind itself. To understand the fear that drove the people of Wharram Percy, we must first set aside almost everything we instinctively believe about the boundary between the living and the dead. For us, that boundary is a wall. It is firm, and it is final, and it is one way. The dead are gone. Whatever we may believe about the soul and the hereafter, we do not, most of us, expect the body in the grave to do anything ever again except slowly return to the earth. The dead stay dead. This is so deeply assumed by us that we hardly even think of it as belief. It is simply, to our minds, the way things are. But this was not the way things were to the medieval mind. For the people of Wharram Percy, and for the wider medieval world around them, the boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall, it was a veil, thin and permeable, and in certain places and at certain times, frighteningly easy to cross. The dead were not simply gone, they were near. They lingered at the edges of the living world, in the churchyard, in the memory and the prayers of those left behind, and under certain conditions it was believed they could come back across the veil. Not as gentle visiting spirits, not as comforting presences, but as something far more physical and far more dreadful. We must be careful here, and precise, because the thing the medieval villager feared was not what we usually mean today by a ghost. A ghost, to the modern imagination, is an insubstantial thing, a wisp, a presence, a cold spot in a room, perhaps a sad and harmless echo of a person who once was. The medieval revenant was nothing so gentle and nothing so airy. The revenant was the corpse itself, the actual physical body risen from its grave and walking. Not a spirit that had slipped free of the flesh, but the dead flesh itself, reanimated, heaving the earth aside and clambering out of the grave, and moving by night through the lanes and yards of the place it had known in life. Picture it as they pictured it, if you dare, here in the safety of your warm and lamplit room, the body as it would be some days or weeks after burial, swollen, discoloured, corrupt, and yet moving. Walking with a heavy, dreadful tread, bloated and reeking, carrying with it the stench of the grave an odour that the chronicles describe as poisoning the very air, spreading sickness wherever it passed. This was the revenant. The word itself comes from the Old French, and it means very simply, the one who returns, or the one who comes back. And come back they did, in story after story, account after account, all across medieval England and medieval Europe, troubling the living, spreading disease, attacking those they had once loved, and, in the most fearful tellings, dragging others down with them into death. Why would the dead do such a thing? The medieval explanations varied, and we will come to them, but at the heart of the fear lay a kind of dreadful logic about the relationship between the body and the soul. In the proper order of things, when a person died well and was buried well, the soul departed on its appointed journey, and the body lay quiet in its consecrated grave, awaiting the final resurrection. Body and soul were, for the time being, properly separated and properly settled. But sometimes, it was believed, this proper separation failed. Sometimes a soul, for one reason or another, could not or would not depart. Sometimes a body, for one reason or another, would not lie quiet. And when that happened, the result was the revenant. A body that the soul, or some restless and malign animating force, would not release. A thing that should be dead, and was dead, and yet would not behave as the dead should behave. And here we begin to see why the response was what it was. If the problem is a body that will not stay dead, that rises and walks and harms the living, then the solution, the only solution, is to make that body incapable of rising and walking ever again. You cannot reason with it. You cannot pray it back into its grave, for it has already defied the prayers said over its burial. You must, instead, deal with the body itself physically, decisively. You must unmake it. You must take it apart so thoroughly that it can never again be a whole and functioning thing, never again rise, never again walk, never again return. And this precisely is what was done to the 10 of Wharram Percy. The cutting at the head and neck, the attempt to remove the head so that the thing could not see, could not rise, could not be itself. The breaking of the bones, the dismemberment, so that the body could not move as a body. And above all the fire, the burning, the reduction of the dangerous corrupt flesh toward ash, so that there would be nothing left to come back. Decapitation, dismemberment, burning. Read in the light of the medieval fear of the revenant, these are not the acts of madmen or monsters. They are the careful, logical, almost ritual steps of people doing exactly what their understanding of the world told them must be done, to protect themselves and their children from a horror they believed in completely. It is easy, sitting where we sit, to call this superstition, and to feel ourselves very far above it. But before we do, we should sit for a moment longer with how reasonable it would have felt from the inside. These were people without our knowledge of disease, without our understanding of how the body decays, without our science and our certainty. They lived in a world full of forces they could neither see nor explain, and they had, in their chronicles and their traditions and the tales told around their fires, a great body of testimony, sober and serious testimony, from respected and educated men, that the dead did indeed sometimes rise, and that there was indeed a way to stop them. To act on that testimony in the face of a death that frightened them was not foolish. It was, by the lights of their world, the responsible thing to do, and to understand just how seriously that world took the walking dead, we must now turn to the men who wrote the stories down, for we do not have to guess at what the medieval English believed about the returning dead. They told us themselves, in their own words, and those words have survived. In the latter part of the 12th century, in a quiet priory in the north of Yorkshire, not so very far from the valley of Wharram Percy itself, a monk named William sat down to write a history of his own times. We know him as William of Newburgh, after the priory of Newburgh where he lived and worked, and he is remembered as one of the most careful and level-headed of the medieval English chroniclers. This is important, so let us dwell on it. William was not a teller of wild tales. He was a serious historian by the standards of his age, sceptical, thoughtful, often impatient with the fanciful stories told by lesser writers. He was the kind of man who weighed his evidence and doubted what deserved doubting, and it is precisely this careful, sceptical man who gives us some of the most detailed and disturbing accounts of the walking dead that survive from medieval England. William, writing of these matters, confessed himself almost overwhelmed by them. He wrote that it would be difficult to believe that the corpses of the dead should rise from their graves and move about, were it not that there were so many well-attested instances of it in his own time, supported by such abundant testimony, that he could not in honesty deny it. He admitted that to record every such case would be far too great a labour, there were simply too many. Think on that for a moment. Here is a sober, sceptical, educated monk, telling us that in his own day the accounts of the walking dead were so numerous and so well supported by witnesses that he could not dismiss them and could not even hope to write them all down. This was not a fringe belief held by a few frightened peasants. This was something woven through the fabric of the age, taken seriously at every level of society, from the villain in his longhouse to the learned monk in his priory. Let us hear one of the accounts that William set down, the one concerning the town of Berwick, in the borderlands of the north. There was, William tells us, a man of considerable wealth, but of evil life, who died and was buried. And no sooner was he in the ground than he began to leave it. By night, the dead man rose from his grave and wandered through the streets and lanes of the town, and behind him, wherever he went, ran a great pack of dogs, howling and baying in the darkness, as though they alone could sense the dreadful thing that moved among the sleeping houses. The people of Berwick were seized with terror. They shut themselves in their homes after dark. No one dared to be abroad while the corpse was walking, for fear of being struck down or harmed by it, and they grew certain, as the nights went on, that if nothing were done, the very air would become so corrupted by the wanderings of this dead thing that disease would break out and many would die. And so the people of Berwick took action. A group of brave young men, William tells us, resolved to put an end to the horror. They gathered together, and they dealt with the body in the only way they believed would work. They cut it apart, they dismembered the corpse, and then they burned the pieces, reducing the dreadful thing to ash and smoke. And once this was done, once the body had been unmade and consumed by fire, the wandering ceased. The dead man walked no more. The town was at peace. But William adds a grim coda, for he tells us that even so, a great pestilence broke out in Berwick afterwards, and carried off many of its people, as though the corruption the dead man had spread could not be entirely undone even by his burning. Hold that account in your mind and notice how exactly it matches what was done at Wharram Percy. A dead body believed to be rising and walking, a community gripped by fear, a spreading sickness blamed upon the restless dead. And then the remedy. Not prayer, not a second burial, but the cutting apart of the body, the dismemberment, and the burning of the pieces to ash. This is not a coincidence. This is the same belief and the same response that the bones in the Yorkshire pit silently record. William of Newburgh, writing in the very same region, gives us the words to go with the bones. He tells us what the people of a place like Wharram Percy believed, and what they did about it, in language we can read across 800 years. What is so striking and so important about William's testimony is the matter-of-fact way in which he relates it. He's not writing a horror story to thrill his readers. He's recording soberly what he believed to be true events, attested by reliable witnesses that had happened in his own lifetime in places he could name. To him, and to the people he wrote about, the walking dead were not a fantasy or an entertainment. They were a real and present danger, as real as a failed harvest or an outbreak of fever, and the dismembering and burning of a suspected revenant was not a barbaric superstition, but a sensible and necessary public safety measure, undertaken to protect the whole community from a deadly threat. And the account of Berwick was only one of several that William recorded. He wrote of other cases, in other places, each one a little different in its details, but all sharing the same dreadful core: the dead who would not rest, the terror of the living, and the violent unmaking of the corpse as the only sure remedy. There was the case in Buckinghamshire, far to the south, which shows us that this was not merely a northern superstition, but something found across the whole breadth of England. And there were others still, including one of the most vivid and terrible of all the medieval revenant tales, a story from an abbey concerning a man who'd been a priest in life and who in death became one of the most fearsome of all the walking dead. It is to that account and to one or two others like it that we turn next, for in them we will see the medieval fear of the returning dead in its fullest and most frightening flower, and we will understand more deeply than ever exactly what the people of Wharram Percy believed they were facing on the night they took fire and blade to their own dead. Among the accounts that come down to us from the 12th century, one of the most famous concerns are placed in the borderlands, an abbey at Melrose, and a man who'd been a priest. In life, the story goes, this priest had been worldly and careless of his sacred duties, a man more given to hunting and to the pleasures of the chase than to prayer, so that he earned, even in death, a mocking name that meant something like the dog priest, on account of the hounds he had loved so well. And when this careless priest died, he too refused to keep to his grave. By night the dead priest rose, and he made his way toward the cloister of the abbey, and toward the chamber of a noblewoman whom he had served in life, troubling her with his dreadful presence, groaning and wandering in the dark. The terror he caused was great, for an abbey was a place of holiness, and to have the corrupt and restless dead intruding upon its sacred precincts was a horror of the deepest kind. At last a brave monk, together with a few companions, resolved to keep watch by the dead man's grave and to confront the thing when it rose. Through the long cold hours of the night they waited, and when at last the corpse came heaving up out of the earth, the monk struck at it with a great blow, and the dead thing fled back to its grave, the earth opening to receive it and closing over it again. And when, in the daylight, they opened the grave to be sure, they found the body marked with the wound, and lying in fresh blood, the sign of its dreadful nightly wanderings. And so they did what had to be done. They took the body out and they burned it, and they scattered the ashes, and the hauntings ceased. Notice once again the shape of the tale. A person who had lived badly, a corpse that would not rest, a community, even a holy community gripped by fear, and the remedy, always the same in the end, the destruction of the body by fire. The medieval imagination returns to this solution again and again, across different places and different tellings, because it followed inexorably from the underlying belief. If the danger is a body that walks, you must destroy the body. Fire is the surest destruction. Therefore, you burn the dead. There is another account, perhaps the most vivid and horrifying of them all, concerning a place that the chronicler calls Anantis, somewhere in the north of England. Here again a man of wicked life died badly, and was buried, and rose again to torment the living. But this account dwells in dreadful detail upon the state of the body when at last it was dug up. For when the terrified inhabitants, driven beyond endurance by the nightly wanderings and by a sickness that had begun to spread through the town, took spades and dug down into the grave, they found the corpse not wasted and decayed as a buried body should be after its time in the earth, but swollen and gorged and bloated to a horrible size, its face flushed and engorged, as though it had been feeding through the nights of its wandering. The shroud in which it had been wrapped was torn and disordered, and when one of the young men, in his rage and terror, struck the body a blow with a sharp spade, it is said that blood flowed out of it in such quantity that they understood at once what manner of thing they were dealing with. A leech, the chronicler calls it, a thing that had been gorging itself on the blood of the living, and so, once more, the body was dealt with as such bodies always were. The heart was torn out, for it was believed that the heart was the seat of the dreadful life that animated the corpse, and that without it the thing could not endure. The body was then carried out beyond the town and burned upon a pyre until nothing remained but ash. And only then, the chronicler tells us, did the hauntings cease, and did the spreading sickness at last abate. sit with the details of that account for a moment, in the quiet, and notice how much it reveals about the medieval understanding of what was happening. The swollen, blood-gorged corpse, the belief that the dead thing was feeding upon the living, the connection drawn between the walking dead and the spread of disease, the removal of the heart, the burning of the body. These are the raw materials centuries before the word existed in our language of everything we would later come to associate with the vampire. The medieval revenant is, in a very real sense, the ancestor of the vampire of later folklore and of modern story. The bloated body that will not decay, the feeding upon the living, the spreading of death, the need to destroy the heart and burn the corpse, all of it is here, in these sober 12th century chronicles, set down not as entertainment but as fact. And these tales were not confined to one chronicler or one corner of the land. Around the same time, another writer, Walter Map, a courtier and cleric of wide learning and sharp wit, recorded his own accounts of the walking dead, of corpses that rose to trouble the living and that had to be dealt with by decapitation and by other physical means. The fact that two such different men, in different parts of the kingdom, writing independently, both recorded these stories as true and current events tells us how widespread and how seriously held the belief truly was. The walking dead were not the obsession of a single frightened community or the invention of a single imaginative writer. They were part of the shared mental world of medieval England, a danger that everyone knew about, that everyone feared, and that everyone agreed must be met when it came with fire and with blade. We could go on. There are other accounts, from other places and other writers, each adding its own chilling detail to the picture. But we have heard enough, I think, to understand the world in which the people of Wharram Percy lived, and to grasp the fear that moved them. We have heard the sober testimony of careful men that the dead did rise, and that the remedy was always to unmake the body and burn it. And now, with all of this in our minds, the broken and burned bones in the Yorkshire pit are no longer a baffling mystery. They are the physical trace of exactly the belief and exactly the practice that the chroniclers describe. The bones and the books agree. They tell, between them, a single coherent story. But there is one more question we must ask, and it is perhaps the most human question of all. Of all the people who died in Wharram Percy across its long centuries, why were these particular 10 singled out? What made one corpse a danger to be burned, while 1,000 others were laid peacefully to rest? To answer that, we must look into the medieval idea of the bad death. There is one more account from the medieval chronicles that we must hear, for it ties together almost every thread of our story, and it comes from a different writer again, a monk named Geoffrey of Burton, who set it down in the early 12th century. It concerns a place called Drakelow, and it is, in its way, the most complete of all the revenant tales because it joins the fear of the walking dead directly to the death of a village itself. The story begins, as so many of these stories do, with a quarrel and a flight. Two peasants, bound to the land as villains were, fled from their lord, abandoning the village where they belonged, and seeking the protection of another lord nearby. This was no small thing in the medieval world, for it broke the bonds of obligation that held the whole order of society together, and it set the two lords against one another in anger. In the dispute that followed, things went badly, and the two runaway peasants died suddenly, both of them, on the very same day. They had died then, in the worst possible circumstances, in the midst of a sinful flight, in the heat of a bitter quarrel without time to make their peace. A bad death indeed. And they were buried. But they did not stay buried. That very night, Geoffrey tells us, the two dead men were seen abroad. They rose from their graves carrying upon their shoulders the very wooden coffins in which they had been laid, and they wandered through the lanes of the village they had fled to by night, calling out and rattling and filling the darkness with dreadful sound. They appeared, the chronicle says, sometimes in the shape of men carrying their coffins, and sometimes in the shapes of beasts, and they roamed the village night after night, refusing to rest. And then, as in so many of these accounts, the sickness came. a terrible pestilence broke out among the living of the village. People began to sicken and to die, one after another, with frightening speed, until in a very short time almost the entire population of the village had been struck down, and the survivors were seized with absolute terror, certain beyond doubt that the 2 walking corpses were the cause of all their suffering and all their dying. At last the few who remained could bear it no longer, and they went to the Lord and to the bishop, and they obtained permission to do what had to be done. They went to the graves of the 2 dead men, and they dug them up, and they found the bodies, as the bodies in these tales are always found, undecayed, fresh, not as the dead should be. And so they performed the remedy, the same remedy we have seen again and again. They cut off the heads of the corpses, they tore out their hearts, and they burned the bodies and the hearts until nothing remained but ash. And the chronicle records that as the hearts were torn out and the bodies destroyed, the evil spirit that had animated them was seen to depart in the form of dark birds or foul shapes fleeing into the air. And from that moment, the wanderings ceased, and the pestilence abated, and the dying stopped. But notice the ending, for it is what makes this tale so important to our story. The village did not recover. So many had died in the pestilence, and so many of the survivors fled in terror from a place that had become a byword for horror, that the village of Draculo was abandoned, emptied, left to fall silent and return to the earth. The fear of the walking dead and the plague that fear was bound up with had not merely terrorized the village, it had ended it. Here, in a single 12th century account, we see all the elements together: the bad death, the walking corpses, the spreading sickness, the decapitation, the tearing out of the heart, the burning of the body, and then the death of the village itself, depopulated and deserted, joining the long roll of England's vanished communities. It is worth pausing on how closely this matches what the bones of Wharram Percy silently record. The decapitation, the cutting at the head and neck, the destruction of the body, the burning, the connection drawn, always between the restless dead and the spread of disease through the living community. Geoffrey of Burton, writing of Draculo, and the bones lying in the Yorkshire pit are telling the same story in different languages, one in words on parchment, the other in scorch marks and cut marks on bone. They confirm one another across the centuries. The chronicler tells us what was believed and what was done. The bones prove that it was truly done, in just this way, in a real village, by real and frightened hands. And there is a deeper resonance still. For Draculo and Wharram Percy are both, in the end, deserted villages, places that lived and then died and vanished from the land. The fear of the walking dead and the slow, economic forces of enclosure are very different things, and they emptied villages in very different ways. But they remind us together of the same great truth, that the medieval landscape was full of communities that did not last, that the green and peaceful countryside is layered thick with endings, and that beneath the quiet fields lie countless stories of how the people who once lived there met the great fears and the great forces of their age. Draculo was emptied by terror and plague, Wharram Percy in the end by sheep and silver, but both lie now beneath the grass holding their secrets, waiting for someone to read them. Why these 10? It is the question that lingers once the science and the chronicles have done their work. For the great majority of the dead of Wharram Percy, many hundreds of them across the long life of the village, were buried peacefully in the consecrated ground, prayed over and laid to rest with all the gentle care their community could give. Only a handful, only these 10 were treated as something to be feared and destroyed. Something must have set them apart. Something must have marked them, in the eyes of their neighbours, as the kind of dead who might rise. And when we look into the medieval mind, we find that there was indeed a whole shadowy category of people who were thought to be at risk of becoming the walking dead. It centred on an idea that ran through the entire age, the idea of the good death and its terrible opposite, the bad death. We have already touched upon the good death, the death that everyone hoped for, to die with warning, with time to prepare, to confess one's sins to a priest and be shriven and absolved, to receive the last rites, the holy anointing that prepared the soul for its journey, to die at peace, in one's bed, surrounded by family, having made one's peace with God and with the world, to be buried then in consecrated ground with the full rites of the church. A death like that settled the soul and settled the body. It closed the account properly. The dead who died well had no reason to return, and every protection against doing so. But not everyone died well, and the dead who died badly were a different matter altogether. Consider the kinds of death that frightened the medieval imagination. There was sudden death, death that came without warning, that struck a person down with no time to confess, no time to be shriven, no time to make ready. A man who died suddenly, who was healthy one moment and dead the next, died with his sins unconfessed and his soul unprepared, and such a soul might not find its rest. There was the death of the person who had lived a wicked or notorious life, the sinner, the one whose conduct had set them at odds with God and with the community. Notice how often, in the chronicles we've heard, the revenant was a person of evil life, the wealthy man of bad character at Berwick, the worldly, careless priest, the wicked man of Anantis. The medieval mind drew a direct line between a bad life and a bad death, and a restless corpse. The sinful were the most likely to rise. There were others too who fell under suspicion. The excommunicate, those cut off from the church and its sacraments, who died outside the community of the faithful. Those who had not been properly buried, whose rites had been hurried or incomplete. Those who had died in some shameful or violent way. And, in the wider folklore of these matters, there were even subtler signs that a corpse might be dangerous, a body that did not decay as it should, a body over which strange things were seen, a death that was swiftly followed by other deaths, as though the first dead person were somehow drawing the others after them. This last point is especially important and especially poignant, and we will return to it. For very often, in these accounts, the suspicion that the dead were walking arose precisely when a death was followed by a spreading sickness, by more deaths in quick succession. The living, watching their neighbours and their children sicken and die one after another, with no cause they could see, reached for an explanation, and the explanation they reached for was that the first to die had not stayed dead, and was drawing the rest down into the grave behind them. Think, then, about how this would have played out in a real community, in a place like Wharram Percy. A person dies, perhaps suddenly, perhaps after a difficult or shameful life, perhaps under some shadow of unease. They are buried. And then the trouble begins. Someone falls ill, then someone else. A child sickens and dies. The fear begins to move through the village faster than any fever, from house to house, from whispered word to whispered word. People remember the recent death. They remember that the dead one had died badly, or had lived badly, or that there had been something uneasy about their passing. They begin to wonder. They begin to be afraid. Perhaps someone claims to have seen the dead one moving in the dark, or to have heard them, or to have felt their dreadful presence. And the fear builds and builds, until at last the community can bear it no longer, and they do the thing that their whole understanding of the world tells them is the only way to be safe. They go to the grave, or to the body, and they unmake it. This, almost certainly, is the human story behind the bones in the Yorkshire pit. Not a single dreadful event, but a pattern repeated, perhaps, several times across the years, each time a death that frightened the living, each time followed by the terrible remedy. For remember that the 10 were of different ages and both sexes, and there is no reason to think they all died at once. The pit may represent not one night of horror, but a tradition, a recurring practice stretching across the generations, the accumulated remains of every villager who, over many years, was judged too dangerous in death to be allowed to rest in the holy ground. Each one a person who had died under some shadow, whose death had been followed by misfortune, whose neighbours had grown afraid, each one unmade and burned and set apart out of a fear that we can name and even, in our way, understand. For at bottom, this is not a story about monsters, and it is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about fear, and about grief, and about powerlessness. These were people surrounded by deaths they could not explain and could not prevent. They watched their children sicken and die with no understanding of why and no power to stop it. They lived in a world that offered them, in such moments, very few comforts and very few weapons. And the belief in the walking dead, terrible as it was, gave them something that fear and grief always crave. It gave them an explanation for the inexplicable, a reason for the unbearable, and it gave them something to do. In the face of a spreading death they could not understand, they were not entirely helpless. There was an action they could take, there was a way to fight back, and so they took up the blade and they lit the fire, not out of savagery, but out of love, and out of terror, and out of the desperate human need to protect the living from a danger they believed in with all their hearts. And there was one shadow above all others, in the later centuries of the village's life, that made that danger seem more real and more pressing than ever before. That shadow was the Great Dying. That shadow was the plague. There is a deep and troubling tension at the very heart of this story, and we must sit with it for a while, gently, because it tells us something profound about how ordinary people actually lived their faith. For everything that was done to the dead of Wharram Percy, the burning, the breaking, the denial of the consecrated ground, ran directly against the official teaching of the very church to which these people so devoutly belonged. The church did not sanction the mutilation of corpses. It did not teach that the dead rose to walk and feed upon the living. Its learned theologians, in the great cathedrals and the universities, would have regarded the burning of a suspected revenant as something close to superstition, even to sin. And yet it was done by faithful Christian villagers in a Christian land. How can we make sense of that? To understand it, we must understand the medieval church's own teaching about the dead and about what awaited the soul beyond the grave. For the church taught that when a person died, their soul did not simply pass straight to heaven or to hell. Most souls, it was believed, went first to a place of waiting and of cleansing, a place called purgatory, where the stains of sin were slowly burned away through suffering, until the soul was at last made pure enough to enter heaven. And the length and the severity of that suffering could be eased, the church taught, by the prayers of the living. This is why the prayers for the dead mattered so enormously, why families paid for masses to be said for departed souls, why the dead and the living remained bound together in a great community of mutual care. The living prayed the dead through their purgation. It was an act of love that crossed the boundary of the grave, so the official teaching gave death a clear and comforting shape. The body rested in consecrated ground, awaiting the final resurrection. The soul was cleansed in purgatory, helped along by the prayers of the living. There was no room in this official theology for corpses that rose and walked. The dead were elsewhere, in purgatory, in the hands of God, not roaming the lanes at night carrying their coffins. To believe otherwise was, strictly speaking, to stray from the teaching of the church. And yet the belief in the walking dead flourished anyway, all across medieval Christendom, held by peasants and monks alike, recorded by sober chroniclers, acted upon with fire and blade. This tells us something we must never forget about the medieval world, and indeed about the human world in every age. The faith that people actually lived was not always the faith that the theologians taught. Beneath the official doctrine of the church ran a deep and ancient river of older belief, of folk tradition, of inherited fears and remedies that stretched back long before Christianity ever came to these islands. The fear of the restless dead was far older than the church. It belonged to a layer of the human mind more ancient than any doctrine. And Christianity, when it came, did not so much erase these older fears as settle over the top of them, like new snow over old ground, with the old shapes still visible beneath. and so the medieval villager lived in two worlds at once and saw no great contradiction in it. On a Sunday, he prayed in the church for the souls of his dead, trusting them to God and to purgatory and to the comfort of the official faith. And on a night of terror, when a corpse was believed to be walking and the sickness was spreading through his children, he reached past that official faith to the older, deeper remedy and took up the fire and the blade. The two things coexisted in the same hearts, the same heads, the same trembling hands. The gentle theology of purgatory and the savage practicality of burning the restless dead were not, to the medieval villager, opposites to be reconciled. They were simply different tools for different moments, drawn from the same deep well of belief about death and the dead. This is perhaps the most human thing of all in our whole story, and the thing that should make us slowest to judge. For we too live in more than one world of belief at once, more than we usually like to admit. We too hold our official understandings of how the world works, and then, in moments of fear or grief or love, reach past them for older comforts and older fears that reason cannot quite dislodge. The medieval villager who prayed for his dead on Sunday and burned a suspected revenant on a dark Tuesday night was not a hypocrite and was not a fool. He was a frightened human being, drawing on every resource his world had given him, official and unofficial, new and ancient, to face the unbearable fact of death. And when the official comforts were not enough, when the prayers seemed not to hold back the spreading sickness, he turned to the older way and did the terrible practical thing that his deepest inheritance told him would work. The bones at Wharram Percy, then, are not only evidence of a strange belief, they are evidence of this whole hidden landscape of the medieval mind, this coexistence of the official and the ancient, the prayed and the feared, the church and the older dark. They show us that the real religion of the medieval village was richer and stranger and more layered than any catechism. And they remind us that beneath the orderly surface of the medieval Christian world, with its bells and its prayers and its tidy theology of purgatory, there ran always this deep cold current of older fear. Most of the time it stayed hidden beneath the snow, but on certain nights, in certain places, when death pressed too close and the prayers seemed to fail, it rose to the surface, and the fire was lit, and the blade was drawn, and a frightened community did what the oldest part of its soul believed it must. In the middle of the 14th century, a horror came to England that surpassed anything in living memory or in the memory of any generation before. It came out of the east, travelling along the trade routes, creeping closer year by year, until at last it crossed the narrow sea and made landfall on English shores. We call it the Black Death, and it was a pestilence of such ferocity that it is difficult even now to grasp its scale. In the space of a very few years, it killed something close to half of all the people in the land, not half of the sick, not half of the poor, half of everyone, half of England gone in the span of a few terrible seasons. Try to imagine what that meant in a small community like Wharram Percy. Imagine the village as we have come to know it, its 2 rows of houses, its church, its close-knit families who had lived in that valley for generations. And then imagine the pestilence arriving. It would have begun perhaps with a single death, then another, and then a flood. Whole households emptied in a matter of days, families wiped out entirely with no one left to mourn them. The sick dying in agony, with the dreadful swellings and the black blotches upon the skin that gave the disease its name, while the well looked on in helpless terror, not knowing who would be struck next, or why, or how to stop it. The bell of St. Martin's tolling and tolling for the dead until, in the worst of it, there were scarcely enough living hands left to dig the graves, and the proper rites of burial, so precious to these people, had sometimes to be hurried or abandoned in the sheer overwhelming press of the dying. Now place yourself inside the mind of a person living through that, a person who already believed, with complete and unquestioning sincerity, that the dead could rise, The plague did not change the underlying belief. The walking dead had been feared long before the pestilence came, as we have seen from the chronicles of the 12th century 200 years earlier. But the plague poured fuel upon that fear and made it burn hotter and more desperately than ever before. For here, suddenly, was death on a scale never seen. Here were the dead in numbers beyond counting. Here were deaths that were sudden and terrible and utterly inexplicable, for no one then understood what caused the pestilence or how it spread. And here, above all, was exactly the pattern that the medieval mind associated most strongly with the walking dead: a death followed by more deaths, a single corpse seemingly drawing others after it into the grave, sickness spreading from house to house as though something were carrying it. In a world without the germ theory of disease, without any understanding of the fleas and the rats and the bacterium that truly drove the plague, the spread of the sickness cried out for explanation. And one of the explanations that lay ready to hand deep in the inherited beliefs of the people was the walking dead. If a person died, and then their neighbours began to die, and then the death spread outward through the village like ripples in a pond, was it not possible? Was it not even likely that the first to die had not stayed dead? That they were rising by night and spreading their corruption and drawing the living down after them? The very corpse that lay newly buried in the churchyard might be the source of the whole catastrophe. And if so, then the remedy was clear, the same remedy it had always been. Find the body, unmake it, burn it, stop it from spreading death. We cannot say for certain that the bones in the Wharram Percy pit date specifically to the years of the Black Death, for the dating of the deposit is broad, and the practice may have stretched across a long period of the village's life before the plague as well as during and after it. But we can say with confidence that the centuries in which the fear of the walking dead burned most fiercely were also the centuries in which death itself was at its most sudden, its most common, and its most impossible to understand. The two things went together. The revenant was the nightmare of a people who were burying far more of their own than any heart could bear, and who needed, with a desperation we can scarcely imagine, to believe that there was still something they could do. That in the face of a death that took their children and their parents and their neighbours without reason and without mercy, they were not entirely powerless, that there was an enemy that could be fought and a weapon that could fight it, and so we should not picture the people who unmade the dead of Wharram Percy as cold or savage. We should picture them as frightened and grieving and exhausted by loss. We should picture a community that had perhaps watched half its number die, that had buried more of its own than it could bear, that lived in daily terror of who would be taken next. And we should understand that, for such a community, the burning of a suspected corpse was not an act of horror, but an act of hope. It was the one thing they could do. It was a way of fighting back against a darkness that otherwise gave them nothing to fight. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that, when you let yourself feel it fully. People reaching, in the depths of their terror and their grief, for the only weapon their world had given them, and turning it, with trembling hands, upon the bodies of the very neighbours they had loved. The fear of the returning dead, then, was not a strange aberration confined to one odd village in the Yorkshire hills. It was woven deep into the fabric of the medieval world, and it grew most powerful in exactly those times of mass death when the need for an explanation and for an action was greatest. And if that is true, then we should expect to find the traces of this fear not only at Wharram Percy, but elsewhere too, scattered across the landscape of medieval England and beyond. And indeed we do. For Wharram Percy, strange as it is not entirely alone. Across England, and across the wider medieval world, archaeologists have found other burials that do not fit the gentle pattern, other dead who were treated in their graves as though the living feared what they might do. It is to these other strange burials, and to what they tell us about how widespread this fear truly was, that we turn next. Wharram Percy is the most striking example we have of the unmaking of the suspected dead in medieval England. But it is not the only one. Across the country and across the centuries, archaeologists have uncovered burials that depart, sometimes subtly and sometimes dramatically, from the ordinary Christian pattern. Scholars have a name for these. They call them deviant burials, which is simply a careful way of saying burials that do not follow the normal rules. And while not every deviant burial is a defense against the walking dead, for there were many reasons a body might be treated unusually, a great many of them seem to speak of exactly the same fear that left its mark in the Yorkshire pit. The fear that this particular corpse, for this particular reason, must not be allowed to rise. Consider the practice of burying a body face down, prone, with its face toward the earth rather than turned up toward heaven, as a proper Christian burial should be. This is one of the most common forms of deviant burial, found at sites across England and across Europe and across many centuries. There were various reasons it might be done, but one understanding of it speaks directly to our story. A corpse buried face down, it was thought, if it tried to claw its way upward out of the grave, would only dig itself deeper into the earth, away from the world of the living. The downward-facing body could not find its way back to the surface. It was a way of trapping the dangerous dead in the ground, of ensuring that even if the corpse stirred and tried to rise, it would only bury itself more deeply. A simple, grim insurance against the walking dead. Consider, too, the practice of weighting a body down, of placing heavy stones upon the corpse, upon the chest, upon the limbs, pinning it into its grave so that it could not rise, or the placing of stones or other objects into the mouth of the dead. Burials have been found in which a stone, or a brick or some other object, was wedged into the jaws of the corpse, and one reading of this disturbing practice is that it was meant to prevent the dead from feeding, or from speaking, or from chewing its way free of its shroud and its grave, all things that the walking dead were variously believed to do. To stop the mouth was to stop the corpse from doing the dreadful things that hungry, restless corpses did. And consider the most dramatic measures of all, the ones that echo most directly what was done at Wharram Percy. The decapitation of the corpse, the removal of the head, and sometimes its placement elsewhere in the grave, between the legs, or beside the feet, far from where it belonged, so that the body could not be whole, could not see, could not rise as itself. The deliberate breaking or removal of limbs, and the burning of the body, the most thorough unmaking of all. Across England and across the wider medieval and post-medieval world, in folklore and in the hard physical evidence of the grave, we find these same measures repeated, the same logic at work. If you fear the dead will rise, you must make the body incapable of rising. You pin it down, you stop its mouth, you take its head, you break it, you burn it. What all of this tells us is that the people of Wharram Percy were not strange. They were not uniquely cruel or uniquely fearful or uniquely backward. They were ordinary medieval people, sharing in a belief and a set of practices that stretched across their entire world. The same fear that lit the fire in the Yorkshire Valley lay behind the face-down burials and the weighted corpses and the stones in the mouths of the dead, all across the land. The walking dead were a shared nightmare, and the unmaking of the corpse was a shared defence, and Wharram Percy is simply the place where, by the accident of careful excavation and patient science, we can see that nightmare and that defence with unusual clarity. And this belief did not die with the Middle Ages. This is perhaps the most sobering thought of all. The fear of the returning dead and the practice of mutilating corpses to prevent their rising persisted in the folklore of Europe for centuries after the medieval period had passed. In the later centuries, in Eastern and Central Europe especially, the revenant of the medieval imagination evolved into the vampire of folk belief, and there are well-documented accounts, from as recently as a few hundred years ago, of communities digging up suspected corpses, finding them bloated and seemingly undecayed, and dealing with them in ways that would have been entirely familiar to the people of Wharram Percy, driving stakes through them, removing and burning their hearts, burning the whole body to ash. The same fear, the same logic, the same dreadful remedy, persisting in the dark corners of the human imagination for hundreds upon hundreds of years. We carry it still in a way, though we have dressed it in entertainment and stripped it of its terror. The vampire and the zombie, the undead that rise from their graves to feed upon and to spread death among the living, the monsters of our films and our stories, are the direct descendants of the medieval revenant, of the fear that left its mark on the bones at Wharram Percy. When we sit in the dark and thrill safely to a tale of the walking dead, we are playing with a fear that our ancestors did not play with, but lived and died with, and acted upon with fire and blade. The distance between us and them is not as great as we like to think. They believed the dead could rise. We pretend to, for the pleasure of being frightened. The same shape of fear runs through both, across all the centuries that divide us. So the bones in the Yorkshire pit are not an isolated curiosity. They're a window onto a fear that gripped a whole world, that lay behind countless strange burials across the land, that persisted for centuries, and that echoes faintly in our own imaginations even now. They are the trace of one community's encounter with a terror that all medieval communities shared. But that community, Wharram Percy itself, the living village in whose soil these dark secrets were kept, did not last forever. The fear of the dead did not destroy it. Something quieter, and in its own way just as final, did that. The village that had held its breath in the fold of the hills for 600 years came, at last, to its ending. And that ending too is part of our story, for it is the reason the bones lay undisturbed for so long, and the reason we can read them now. So let us turn, in these last movements of our long night's journey, to the death of Wharram Percy itself. The ending of Wharram Percy, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no great fire, no massacre, no single catastrophe that swept the village away in a night. There was no plague that emptied it all at once, though the plague had certainly thinned it, as it thinned everywhere. The death of Wharram Percy was a slow and quiet thing, a fading rather than a falling, and it was driven not by terror or by sickness, but by something far more mundane, and in its own way far more relentless. It was driven by money. It was driven, in the end, by wool. To understand this, we must understand what was happening to England in the later medieval centuries, in the 1400s and into the 1500s. The Black Death, terrible as it was, had left the survivors in a changed world. With so many dead, there were far fewer people to work the land, and the labour of those who remained became, for the first time, genuinely valuable. The old bonds of villenage, which had tied people like the villagers of Wharram Percy to their lords and their land, began to loosen and break down. People could move more freely, demand better terms, seek their fortunes elsewhere. The rigid old order of the medieval countryside was coming apart, and at the same time the great landowners were discovering a new and powerful source of wealth. English wool had long been prized, but now the trade in wool and woolen cloth boomed as never before, and the price of wool climbed and climbed. And the landowners, doing their sums, began to realise a hard and transformative truth. A hillside given over to sheep could be worth far more to them than a hillside full of struggling tenant farmers. Sheep did not owe complicated and shrinking rents. Sheep did not demand better wages or threaten to move away. Sheep did not need the elaborate old system of open fields and ploughlands and communal labour. Sheep simply grazed and grew their valuable fleece and turned the green hills into silver. A few shepherds could manage a great flock that brought in more wealth than a whole village of farmers ever had. And so, across England in these centuries, a quiet and momentous transformation took place. Landowners began, deliberately and systematically, to clear the people off the land and replace them with sheep. The historians call it enclosure, and in its later forms it would become one of the great upheavals of English history, but its early stages were already at work in places like Wharram Percy. The tenant farmers were turned out, their leases were not renewed, or they were simply evicted, their houses pulled down or left to fall into ruin, the open fields where generations had grown their bread turned over to pasture for the flocks. A way of life that had endured for 6 centuries was undone, not by sword or by plague, but by the cold arithmetic of profit. At Wharram Percy, the records give us a glimpse of this final act. It is recorded that around the year 1500, the remaining farmsteads of the village, by then only a handful, were cleared, the families turned out of their homes, the houses destroyed, to make way for sheep. A small number of people, a great many sheep. After 600 years, the long human story of the valley was brought quite deliberately to its end. The villagers scattered, drifting away to other places, to towns, to wherever they could find, a living in a world that no longer had a use for them where they had always been. And the houses they left behind, the longhouses with their smoky hearths and their beaten earth floors, were pulled down or simply abandoned to the weather, their timbers rotting, their thatch collapsing, their walls melting slowly back into the earth from which they had been raised. For a time, the Church of St. Martin lingered on, serving the few souls who remained in the district, the shepherds and the scattered folk of the emptied valley. The bell still rang for a while over the silent fields where the village had been, but a church needs a congregation, and the congregation was gone. In time, the church too fell into decline, its roof failing, its walls crumbling, until it became the beautiful and melancholy ruin that stands there still, roofless and open to the sky, the last surviving monument to a place that the world had decided it no longer needed. And here is the quiet irony at the heart of our whole story. It was precisely this emptying, this abandonment, this turning of the valley over to grass and sheep and silence, that preserved the secrets of Wharram Percy for us to find. Had the village lived on, had it grown and changed and modernized as so many villages did, had new houses been built over the old and new fields, ploughed across the ancient ones, the delicate traces of the medieval village would have been churned away and lost. The pit of broken bones would almost certainly have been disturbed, scattered, destroyed, long before any archaeologist could read it. But because the village died, and because it died so quietly and so completely, and because the land was given over to nothing more disturbing than grazing sheep, the whole medieval village was left lying just beneath the turf, undisturbed, waiting. The earthworks of the houses, the buried foundations, the churchyard dead, and the strange, dark deposit of the unmade dead, set apart from the holy ground, lying in its pit through 500 years of silence until the patient hands of the archaeologists came at last to lift it into the light. So the death of the village gave us the life of the village. The abandonment preserved the memory. The silence kept the secret safe until we were ready and able to hear it. There is something fitting in that, something almost gentle in a story that has held so much darkness. The valley that was emptied of its people became, across the long centuries of its sleep, a kind of vast and faithful archive, holding everything that had happened there, holding even the things its people would most have wished to keep hidden, until the day when we could come and read it all. And what we read there changes, just a little, the whole way we understand the people of the medieval past. Wharram Percy was not alone in its dying. This is the last great fact we must take in, and it is a quietly staggering one. The emptying of that one valley in the Yorkshire Wolds was not a singular tragedy, but one small instance of something that happened, again and again, all across England in the later medieval and early modern centuries. For Wharram Percy is only one of perhaps 3,000 deserted medieval villages whose faint traces still lie scattered across the English countryside. 3,000. 3,000 communities that lived and laboured and endured, sometimes for centuries, and then vanished, leaving behind only ripples in the turf and the occasional ruined church, and the silence. Think about what that number truly means. 3,000 villages, each one a place like Wharram Percy, each one full of people who were born there and lived there and died there, who knew every field and every face, who had their own customs and their own quarrels and their own quiet joys, who loved and feared and hoped exactly as we do. 3,000 whole worlds, each as complete and as real to the people who lived in it as your own world is to you. And all of them gone, cleared for sheep, or abandoned after the plague, or drifted away as the old order of the countryside dissolved. 3,000 times over, the bell fell silent, the houses crumbled, and the green turf crept back over the place where a community had been. We walk across them without knowing. This is the strange and haunting truth of the English landscape. The deserted villages are everywhere, hidden in plain sight, written into the ground beneath our feet. That oddly lumpy field beside a country lane, that isolated old church standing alone with no village around it, far from any house, as though it had been left behind by something. Those low ripples and terraces in the grass that you might take for nothing at all. Again and again, these are the graves of vanished communities, the last faint signatures of places where people once lived their whole lives. We picnic in their fields, we walk our dogs across their buried streets. We pass their lonely churches and wonder idly why a church should stand so far from anywhere, never knowing that we are looking at the headstone of a village. The past in England is not safely shut away in museums and history books. It is underfoot. It is in the land itself, in the shape of the ground, in the lumps and hollows of an ordinary field. And once you know how to see it, once someone has taught you to read those ripples in the turf, you can never quite walk through the English countryside in the same way again. You begin to see the ghosts of the vanished villages everywhere. You begin to understand that the green and peaceful landscape, which seems so timeless and so settled, is in truth a vast graveyard of human stories, layer upon layer of forgotten lives, pressed into the earth and waiting, like the bones at Wharram Percy waited for someone to come and read them. And Wharram Percy, of all these thousands of lost places, is the one that has spoken most clearly, because it was studied so long and so carefully, and because the soil there happened to hold that one strange and terrible secret. This single valley has been able to tell us things that no document ever recorded and no chronicle ever dared to write down plainly. It has told us how an ordinary medieval village really lived and worked and ate and suffered and died. And it has told us through those broken and burned bones something deeper and darker and more human still. It has told us what these people feared in the long nights when death moved among them and they did not understand why. It has told us how far they were willing to go, in their terror and their grief, to protect the living from the dead. It has shown us not the medieval world of the textbooks, all kings and cathedrals and tidy dates, but the medieval world as it was actually felt and lived and feared by the ordinary people who made up almost the whole of it. That is the great gift of a place like Wharram Percy, and the great gift of the patient science that has read it. It gives the voiceless a voice. It lets the most ordinary people who ever lived, the people history was never written about, speak to us at last across the centuries, not in words, for they left almost none, but in the marks they left upon the ground and upon their own bones. And what they have to say to us, when we finally learn to listen, is not what we expected. It is stranger and harder and more profoundly human than the gentle, simplified past we were taught. It reminds us that these were not cardboard figures in a costume drama, but real people, as real as we are, living in a world full of fears we have forgotten and forces they could not understand, doing their best by the only lights they had to protect what they loved. And so we come, at the last, to the end of our long night's journey, and to the answer we set out so many hours ago to find. We began with a mystery, a pit of broken, burned and scattered bones in the soil of a vanished English village, the bones of 10 ordinary people, men and women and children, denied the holy ground, their bodies cut and broken and given to the fire, and we asked simply, why? Why would the gentle, praying, ordinary people of a medieval village do such a thing to their own beloved dead? Now, at last, we know. And the knowing changes everything. And so we arrive, at the very last, at the answer we set out this evening to find. Why would the people of a quiet English village break and burn and cut apart their own dead and bury them in fear apart from the holy ground? Not from hunger, though hunger haunted their world. Not from cruelty, for there was no cruelty in it. Not as punishment, for these were their own people, their neighbours and their kin, grown up in the same valley, known and very likely loved. They did it out of fear, a fear so old and so deep and so woven into the fabric of their world that it ran like a dark thread through the whole of the medieval age. The fear that the dead might not stay where they were laid, the fear that on some night, in some grave, the buried would stir and rise and walk and come back to spread death among the living, and the belief, held with absolute sincerity, that the only way to be safe, the only way to protect their children and their homes, was to make certain, with blade and with fire, that these particular dead could never rise again. The bones in that pit are not, in the end, a story of monsters. They never were. They are a story of frightened, grieving, ordinary people, facing deaths they could not explain and could not prevent, in a world that gave them very little power and very little comfort. They are a story of a community that had perhaps buried more of its own than any heart could bear, reaching, in its terror, for the one weapon its world had placed in its hands. They are a story of love in the strangest and most painful of disguises, the desperate love of the living for one another, that would do even this, take fire and knife to the bodies of the dead, if it might keep the living safe for one more long and frightening winter. When we look at those broken bones, we are not looking at savagery. We are looking, across 800 years, into the frightened human heart, and finding there something we still, even now, can recognize. The past is deeper than anyone told you. It is stranger and darker and more tender and more achingly human than the gentle, tidy version you were given in the schoolroom. The medieval people were not simpler than us, not more foolish than us, not further from us than we like to imagine. They were us, in a harder and a darker world, doing their best to make sense of a life full of forces they could not see and could not master. And the proof of it is still there, tonight, as you lie listening in the dark. It is still there, just beneath the grass of an ordinary Yorkshire hillside, in the ripples of a vanished village, and the silence of a roofless church, and the quiet, faithful soil that kept the secret safe for 500 years until we were ready to hear it. It is there in 3,000 other lost villages, scattered across the green and peaceful land, each one holding its own forgotten lives, its own forgotten fears, waiting, as Wharram Percy waited, to be properly understood. That is where we will leave it tonight. In the quiet valley under the wide grey sky, with the long grass moving over the buried houses and the ruined church standing watch over the dead, both the dead who were laid to rest in peace and the dead who were not. The fire is long cold now, the fear is long gone. The people who felt it and the people they feared have all of them returned at last to the same quiet earth, and there is nothing left to trouble the silence of the valley but the wind and the sheep and the endless turning of the seasons. They rest now, all of them, the frightened and the feared alike. They rest at last together. And so it is time for you to rest as well. There is nothing more to fear in this old story, and nothing more you need to do. You have walked a long way with me tonight, all the way back into the deep past of this island, and all the way down into the frightened, faithful heart of a vanished village. And now the journey is over, and you may let it all go. Let the valley fade. Let the bones lie quiet. Let the long centuries close softly over everything we have seen. Until we meet again in another quiet evening, with another long and gentle journey through the half-remembered corners of the past. May you have peace. May you have rest. May you have all the soft and unhurried hours your heart could ask for. Sleep now, sleep deeply, sleep well. Good night, good night, good night.